The G20, which is Group of 20, is not just about 19 member states and the European Union, but it is also about international organizations, invitee countries, invitee organizations. One of the most important organizations that participates in the deliberations and also is a major part of decision-making is the United Nations. To speak more about how the world is coming together to fight climate change, economic recession, the war, so on and so forth, I'm being joined for an exclusive conversation with Shombi. He is the resident coordinator of the United Nations here in India. Thank you so much, Shombi, for joining us here with India Today. A very good morning, Shombi. Let's begin with India's presidency of the G20. There have been about 200 meetings in over 50 cities. How do you look at India's presidency and the focus that India has had on recovery, reform and inclusivity?
Thank you, Geeta. Let me first just say, Mujhe yaha bulane ke liye dhanyavad. It's wonderful to be with you, and this is a very exciting day. We have the Secretary General arriving a bit later in a few hours, of course, together with the heads of state of the G20 and partner countries. I think that, really we have been so much encouraged by the degree to which India's presidency has embraced really the priorities of the United Nations, the SDGs. And in fact, the alignment has been so strong that I've often been calling it an SDG 20 presidency. We feel that India's leadership is exactly the sort of leadership focused on the right priorities at exactly this important moment in time as we are at the midterm of the 2030 agenda. So really you see a fantastic sort of almost handshake between India's presidency, the Leaders' Summit coming, of course, this weekend, and then essentially just over a week from now, the world comes together at the General Assembly for the SDG Summit to take stock of where we are. And India will be bringing a lot of important deliverables to that meeting, a lot of momentum. India's put together an SDG, G20 SDG action plan, for example. India's, this G20 presidency has had more ambitious language around gender equality, around women-led development than ever before. We see a lot of emphasis on climate action and also climate justice. Multilateral development bank reform, many issues that we really highly prioritize have been put at the center here in India's presidency. And really, I think the approach has been, of course, the slogan Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the world is one family. This fits very much with the spirit of the UN. And India has shown, really put action behind those words in terms of inclusive multilateralism, bringing in the African Union, for example, making that proposal, many other examples.
So yes, you are talking about how the presidency has come up with a lot of ideas to come together and work on major issues. But there is a problem, Shombi, when it comes to consensus. There is a problem when it comes to how global politics has really become an impediment in bringing about consensus to what really matters to the world. How do you look at the problems when it comes to not really being able to bring about consensus even for the joint communique?
Look, I think absolutely this is an incredibly tough time. As the Secretary General notes, the world right now is perhaps more divided than it has been, maybe not ever, but for a long time, in recent times, certainly. And I think this is where India's priorities and efforts have been so important, because I believe that the Indian presidency sort of understood that the world was being divided in different ways, east-west divisions over conflict, the war in Ukraine. And India wanted to bring the conversation back to the issues in which the G20 is best sort of able to address, which is issues of financing, issues of economic development, issues of tackling climate change, these sorts of things, not so much the political issues. So I think that's where the primary efforts have been. It's been very difficult, no doubt, but I think that India has been is sort of uniquely placed to take on this challenge. India has a very unique mix of goodwill across north, south, east, west, every direction that you look. India has long been a voice for the Global South and has really made an effort to bring the Global South's voice back to the table in the G20. India, of course, being the only lower middle income country within the G20, but one that is rapidly advancing. Just recently became the 5th largest economy in the world. We saw Chandrayaan-3 landing on the moon. Largest population now, the greatest youth generation, more young minds than any country has ever had to tap. So India is uniquely able, I think, to really build bridges across the divides that have been absolutely a major problem. It's not easy. I don't think anybody in India's G20 team, Sherpa Amitabh Kant, anybody would say this has been an easy job. And of course, the negotiations continue. They're continuing right now, so we can't sort of preempt the final outcome. I'm optimistic that there will be one, despite all of these incredible challenges. And definitely, clearly, India has put forward a tremendous amount of effort, and again, very much aligned with the priorities that we feel, the UN feels, that we need to address as we head to the midterm of the 2030. Again, climate change, digital transitions, green transitions. There's a Green Development Pact that India has put forward, gender equality, disaster risk reduction. You know, this presidency introduced for the first time a disaster risk reduction working group, which is basically looking at helping countries to tackle. Of course, we need climate action, you know, on the mitigation side, but we also need to help especially poorer countries deal with the huge impacts that they're facing. As you know, every year is becoming warmer, every month is becoming warmer, inclement weather is increasing across the board, and so that working group is looking at how do we address the Secretary General's call for early warning systems for everybody within a few years' time. These are the issues that are important.
Okay, then let's just break it down. When you've spoken about consensus, but let's just break it down when it comes to the problem areas. China's obstructionist approach. Russia is not going to flip anytime soon from the Bali Declaration. They're now determined to have no reference to the war in the document. And we also have other countries. There's an East and West divide, or a developed, developing nation divide when it comes to climate change. How are you looking at these problems that exist and the fact that maybe this certainly will be one of the biggest challenges for India?
Sure. So again, absolutely lots of challenges, no doubt about that. And we have to see, again, what comes in these, oftentimes in these sort of multilateral negotiating situations, breakthroughs are made in the final hours. You know, these dramatic scenes of negotiators locking the door and you know, until they come to a consensus. But I certainly can't preempt what will come out of that. But I think that you know, what we have seen is that despite whatever the result is, there are a number of important deliverables that have come out of this presidency, and again have really put the momentum and the focus where it needs to be. So as I mentioned, this presidency has delivered a G20 SDG acceleration action plan, which will bring much needed momentum to the conversation at the General Assembly just literally a week, just over a week from now. This presidency has delivered a new focus on disaster risk reduction, as I said, the new working group. Also on gender equality. There will be a new women's empowerment working group established within the G20 that will be taken forward by Brazil. We look at the financing needs. So, of course, international financial architecture reform is something that the Secretary General has focused a lot on. He's put forward the SDG stimulus plan, his SDG stimulus plan, and that's really looking at you know, restructuring the approach to debt, relieving the debt burden, the asphyxiating debt burden, especially on poorer countries, increasing liquidity, increasing the ability of the international, sort of the MDBs, development banks, to respond to crisis, these sorts of things. A core part of his plan is $500 billion a year of increased official development assistance behind this, together with reform of the international financial architecture. India has, for the first time, launched an independent expert process looking at these financing issues. And in fact, the proposal recommendations coming out of that are very closely aligned with this. They call for something like $3 trillion of additional financing for poor and for developing countries, including a $500 billion increase in direct ODA, which aligns perfectly with our plan. And crowding in private sector, because we estimate the SDG gap right now, the funding financing gap is about $4 trillion a year. That's nothing when you look at the totality of finance that's flowing around the globe. And this independent expert group is looking at $3 trillion. So $3 trillion, $4 trillion. Anyway, it's very clear that we need to dramatically increase the ambition of the international financial architecture. That we need high-income countries to step up to the $100 billion a year commitment coming from Paris, but then also quickly increase that. And these conversations, again, whatever comes in the next hours through this negotiation, this momentum, this discussion, and the way that India has put it on the table will very much carry through to the summit in New York, the SDG summit in New York, and to COP28 coming up a little bit later this year.
Well, Shombi, the other important area that Prime Minister Modi and the Indian administration has been focusing on is reforms. Reforms to reflect what the real new world order really looks like. Whether it is the United Nations, whether it is other international organizations, inclusivity, we are looking at how the international organizations need to be reformed to ensure that there is inclusivity, to provide for and to ensure that there is an eradication of poverty, growth for all. In that, how do you see the proposals for reforms, whether it's multilateral banks, multilateral development banks, or for that matter, United Nations itself?
Well, I think the Secretary General talks about and has been talking about recently that this world that we're in is increasingly a multipolar world. But that in and of itself, let's say a priori, does not mean greater peace and security and sustainability. What we need to ensure that is strong multilateralism. So with multipolarity, which is the reality, this is the future of the world, and India is a very important pole in that multipolarity. We need to strengthen the multilateral organizations that can help bring consensus around challenges and approaches and unify responses, get everybody rowing in the same direction. So I think this is where India's focus has been precisely on strengthening multilateralism, in part through reform. And the Secretary General launched the UN reform process, the UN, of course, being a sort of the umbrella multilateral organization, but there are many different layers, many different dimensions, regional groupings as well, economic, political, and such. So I think that this is critical. India has been pushing on this. India has been talking about reform. You look at the UN. India's a big proponent of UN Security Council resolution, and the Secretary General and the UN institution. Has very much aligned with that. So we need to reform the UN and other multilateral organizations to reflect our current reality. Many of these were developed and designed in the aftermath of the Second World War. So fully on board with those positions.
Well, Shombi, again, there is a very important proposal and initiative by India, that is to bring about inclusivity, bringing in African Union as the new member of the G20, which would lead to what? Representing the new world order, but also the real voice of the global South. How has the United Nations really looked at it, and how is the United Nations viewing this whole addition of the African Union and G20 or 21 becoming the voice of the global South?
Absolutely. And again, I think this is a perfect example of where India's leadership at this moment in time has been so critical in terms of bringing the voice of the global South to the top table. G20 being, of course, something like 80% of the world's wealth, but also 80% plus, and also 80% plus of climate emissions and things. So, which are impacting developing countries, many of which are in Africa, more, and especially communities there facing the real destructive impacts of climate change. So having the African Union, having Voices of Africa, that 1 billion people approximately in Africa, is incredibly important to have that perspective and to have those priorities reflected within the G20 architecture. Of course, again, we move from G20 Leader Summit now to, in just over a week, to the UN General Assembly, where you have the whole world. But it's important to see this kind of convergence where the Global South is not left out of the decision-making that results in real finance and real action being taken in the face of these common challenges.
While the conversations have moved to economic recovery, a lot of geopolitics, there's one aspect that the United Nations has been battling with. The biggest challenge that the United Nations was faced with in the past few years has been the COVID-19 pandemic, and it seems to be returning. We've seen the First Lady of the United States of America, who tested positive and is not traveling to New Delhi. Now we're hearing that the Spanish president also has tested positive, and President Sanchez is also not going to be here for the G20 summit. Lots of hits and misses, but also COVID-19 as a subject is now returning back to the table when it comes to conversations and deliberations and how to tackle this pandemic.
Well, absolutely, and I think certainly the Secretary General and World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, and others from our side have been throughout the sort of easing of the COVID pandemic, warning that, look, it's far too early. First of all, that COVID itself hasn't passed, and secondly, that we have to be prepared for the next pandemic that can come along. So I think this is, again, a growing indicator that indeed we haven't, although despite our best wishes, we have not put COVID completely behind us. Now, the key is to not relax in the early warning system. So that's where WHO and many other and governments coming together, monitoring the situation. This is very important. Keeping data flowing, access to data as well. Now, beyond that, we have to not forget the lessons. We have to continuously apply the lessons that we learned through the spike of the COVID pandemic. And that's about having good testing, that's about having sentinel surveillance, that's about having vaccines available, provided equitably to avoid vaccine sort of hoarding certain countries. And again, here India played a very, very important role. You saw the combination of Indian let's say, capacities in the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmacy to the world, it's often called, developing new vaccines of all different sorts, and providing those vaccines to countries in need, even through the COVAX facility, even providing to UN peacekeepers also. So I think we have we cannot ignore the lessons that we learned, and we need to ensure that we are prepared. The UN has the pandemic preparedness plan, and I think this is just, this is a reminder that even though we wish for the pandemic to be finished, it's not. Luckily, so far, those people who have availed of vaccinations and things, the health impact of these COVID varieties, strains, the latest ones, is not as great as it was before. But this is no time for complacency.
Well, Shombi, you've really responded when it comes to consensus in a very diplomatic fashion. But let me ask you again. There are certain quarters in India and elsewhere who really are talking about whether if it will be a success or a failure for India holding presidency, should there not be a joint document with consensus. If there's a joint document or a joint communique and a separate chair's summary on Russia-Ukraine war, climate change, references that they do not want in the consensus document, how would you look at it? How does the United Nations look at that?
Well, Look, again, I think the challenges are unprecedented, right? You look at when the G20 was sort of initiated, and that was around global financial crisis, which didn't really have such a political sort of aspect to it, right? That was more of a technocratic type of approach. Now the world is in a very different place. This is not business as usual. This is something we've never seen within the era of the G20. So again, I think that really, regardless of the outcome, again, in these coming hours, the last stretch, I would not see this as a failure, because I think there have been many deliverables locked in already, important deliverables locked in, that we from the United Nations see as being very, very important as we head to the General Assembly, the SDG Summit. Again, this handshake that I mentioned. So, really looking at digital transitions, just green transitions, women-led development, climate action, climate justice, and that's a really important part of it, because having the presidency in a country like India, which is both achieving tremendous progress in terms of climate ambitions. I mean, the Panchamrit targets of COP26, 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. These are major commitments, and they're going to be very difficult to achieve. But India is pushing forward on that. We see investments in Indian private sector and renewable energy like I don't think you're seeing anywhere else. Electric mobility, electric vehicles, these sorts of things. At the same time, India is a voice for the Global South, for the developing world, that until the high-income world, let's say, comes forward with the financing and with the technology transfer that it has promised and that it's morally obligated to provide, developing countries will claim their right to develop. This is simply it. And I think the world also changed between COP26 and now, in the sense that we saw when faced with crisis, even high-income countries have been sliding back on some of these commitments, turning on coal power plants and these sorts of things. Why? Because it's a crisis. They say, well, people need to be able to heat their house in the winter. Absolutely. And I think this has brought, for the wrong reasons, this has brought a new level of honesty to the conversation, that the whole world now sees that developing countries have to provide development to their people. So we have to work together to make sure that that is sustainable.
Okay, so you've given a very positive take to the atmospherics when we see the G20 summit and the lead up to the G20 summit. Let's hope that the leaders are able to deliberate and bring about consensus on issues that really matter, not just to India, but to the world. Thank you so much for joining us here on India Today.
Thank you so much. Bahut dhanyawad.